Let us talk about certain specific characteristics of the poetry by South Asian female writers. South Asian women writers have written poetry more than prose. Their poetry reflects their inner being, their poetry reflects their personal information as well as personal experiences, and their poetry not only talks about the experiences within the four walls of the house, but they present experiences outside the house also. They present experiences which they gained after moving in the Canadian society, after facing different hardships, and at the same time they also talk about geographical and political things too. They discuss the politics of their own nation, their motherland, as well as they discuss the politics of this new land, new place, their present home. Their poetry presents the themes of nostalgia, homesickness, homelessness. Their poetry also talks about displacement and uprooting of people as well as the rerouting of the same people. We know that diaspora has been a result of a power game. If we take the example of Indian diaspora, we see that the British pulled people from different regions of India and settled them in various other areas of the world. They took people from India and then placed them in different other countries, the countries that were their colonies. They did so with an intention of establishing their new colonies. So, they took people from India and placed them in Canada also. This was the time when they were focusing on laying down the railway tracks there in Canada. So, colonization and migration, these were the two things which happened simultaneously. These were two concepts which run parallel. Silencing and exclusion are two specific characteristics of colonization. When these colonized people migrated, this migration was not voluntary, but they were forced by their colonizers. They were silenced and they were not allowed to choose. They were given a situation and they were forced to accept that situation. All these things we see in the diasporic societies, and these South Asian poets, they represent this power game in their poetry. So, as we have already discussed that these women poets are survivors, they are fighters who stayed there and struggled hard to create their own space. They did not let the circumstances win, they struggled and they have proven their mettle. These women were educated, these women were employed, and this education proved beneficial for them. It was a boon for them and it helped them in carving a niche for themselves. While talking about poetry and South Asian women, we see that they present the literary tradition in their poems. They have an in-depth knowledge of poetry, they have an in-depth knowledge of all those poetic nuances, and they know how to structure their poems and present different themes that are sometimes similar and at other times extremely unique in their own ways. The most prominent themes presented by these diasporic female writers and poets are presentation of personal, cultural and traditional experiences, talking about feminism, talking about females in their homeland as well as talking about the females in Canada, and they use their poetry as a weapon and they attack on racism and sexism. Here we find a kind of authorial narration. The voice is of that authors. They talk in their poetry. They call for unity. They call for a fight against racism and sexism. So when we read their poetry, when we read the works by these South Asian Canadian writers and poets, we just come across a question: are all these writings, are all these works purely Canadian? We can say that yes, these works are mostly Canadian, and there are certain reasons behind that. The very first reason is the experiences that they are presenting, those experiences are Canadian. However, they are creating a kind of a comparison and contrast between their experiences in Canada as well as their experiences back in their motherlands. And then there is another reason for calling these works as Canadian, because the stories that they represent, those stories are of immigrants, the experiences of the past generation as well as the new generation, the struggles and the theme of identity crisis. Identity plays a very important role in any person's life. They show how this identity experiences cultural shock, goes through a kind of a clash, and then they talk about this specific theme which is called identity crisis. And the setting, when we talk about the setting is most of the time motherland and sometimes Canada. This is one specific characteristic of their poetry which gives like reasons to that question: are all these works purely Canadian? Because the setting of their poetry is most of the time their motherland, and sometimes the setting is Canada. However, while being in Canada, they all the time crave for their homeland, as we know that this is one of the specific features of diasporic literature, to present a longing for the homeland. That is why we see this longing in their works also. After looking at various aspects of their writings, after looking at different themes of their writings, after looking at their style of presenting those themes, after looking at their method of handling those concepts in their literature, in their writings, we see that some of their works stand tall, some of their works originally appear to be Canadian, while there are many of their works that have India or their motherland as the major concept, as the major phenomena, and they appear as if those are representing the motherland. Then they create this question whether that work is Canadian or not. Diane McGifford, in her book The Geography of Voice, also writes that modern Canadian writers have deconstructed the literary canon, and in particular women and ethnic and racial minorities are building rooms of their own, making spaces for just about anybody who loves language and form, has something to say and knows how to say it. So here Diane McGifford says that these women poets, they have something to say. They have so many ideas in their minds, they have so many questions to ask, and they know how to say it in an impressive way. Here we have some examples from these South Asian Canadian poets. The very first example is from Himani Banerjee, which has been taken from the poem Upon Hearing Beverly Glen Copeland. She writes, burst into flames, broke chains, fists, fires and fleeting forms. Into the night, agitation, cries of victory. So here she has created a vivid imagery of that time. She has created a very clear picture of the time where she sees that there are firings, there are slogans that are said, and there are people who are agitating. This firing, this agitation and everything is happening against all those immigrants. Then there is another example by Lakshmi Gill. The name of the poem is Out of Canada. She writes, I cannot die here on the streets of Moncton. I tell myself over and over, people wouldn't know where to send my body. So this is the plight of an immigrant which Lakshmi Gill has shown here in these lines, where she has created a picture of an immigrant who does not want to die in that alien land. Because every immigrant feels connected with his or her birthplace, homeland, because they have their roots there in their homeland. And they do not want to die in that alien land as they think that there is no one who is their own. And this is true also. These immigrants, they crave for their own people, they crave for their family members, they crave for their own place, and they do not want to die in that new land which has not accepted them fully, which still treats them as aliens. Let's have the third example, which is by Uma Parmeswaran. It has been taken from the poem Dileep. Uma writes, Amma, I like school. It is such fun. We play most of the time and sing song in French. Ma, you think you could change my name to Jim or David or something? So here the poet has shown a small boy who is talking to his mother and telling her about the school. The boy says that he enjoys a lot in the school and they sing different songs. All those songs are in French. Uma Parmeswaran in this stanza has shown that when a person migrates from his or her motherland and settles in a new place, the very first thing that the person loses is his or her identity. Here she is showing the next generation of an immigrant family who has lost his linguistic identity. Now these small children are not singing songs in their mother tongue, in the language of their parents, in the language of their forefathers, the language that was their own, the language of their homeland, but they are singing in a totally different language, an entirely alien language, which is French, because they are living in a new land. So they had to leave behind their own language. Another thing that Uma Parmeswaran has presented here is that the boy asks his mother, can you change my name to Jim or David or something? The name of the boy is Dileep, which is the title of the poem also. So Dileep does not like his name because his name is totally different from the names of other boys in his school. So he wants to be a part of them. So this is the dilemma of every immigrant in that new land. Immigrants, specifically the younger generation, they keep on trying to be accepted as the natives by those native people of that country. These immigrants want to be a part of that land, but they remain insider, outsider. They remain foreigner, however differently. Let's take another example. Here Suniti Namjoshi writes in her poem Philomel, she had her tongue ripped out and then she sank down through the centuries so that it seems only fitting that the art she practices should be for art's sake. She had her tongue ripped out. So here the poet shows that the woman is not allowed to speak. She is only allowed to present whatever is accepted in that society. So here she is presenting that normative characteristic of the society where accepted beliefs and accepted practices are supposed to be followed, supposed to be carried forward. Last example here is by Surjit Kalsi. She writes in her poem, I Want My Chaos Back. Today I am 3,000 miles away from throbbing, bubbling figurines of my flesh. How much I miss their presence. The very thought of not being with them makes my heart droop. She says that she is very far away from her homeland, from her motherland, and whenever she imagines about her homeland, her heart drops down. Her heart misses a beat. Her heart craves for that good old time which she has left behind. So these immigrant writers have been creating images of their homeland as well as their present home, and she has been presenting the plight and the dilemma of migrant women in their poetry. We will discuss about all these concepts in detail in the lectures to come. That's all for today. Thank you.